Okay, here's something that might have flown under the radar for some people. The U.S., relatively recently, granting refugee status to white South Africans.
Yeah.
It's a headline that definitely makes you stop and think.
It really does. And, to try and understand this, it's quite a surprising development. We've been looking at a YouTube transcript from Ben Shapiro. He sort of unpacks the policy, the controversy around it, and importantly, the historical background.
Exactly, because the image of white individuals needing refuge in America is, well, it's unusual for many people. And the whole debate that followed about assimilation, that seems key. Okay, so let's start right there. What exactly happened? What's the core news?
Right. So the transcript lays out how the Trump administration specifically made this decision, granting refugee status to white South Africans, primarily Afrikaners, Boers.
Okay.
And the New York Times apparently reported on, dozens arriving on a charter flight. This was happening while President Trump was talking publicly about farmers being killed in South Africa.
Right, I remember that. He seemed quite concerned, even mentioned it might affect a G20 meeting.
He did, yeah.
Yeah.
And he used some pretty strong language, didn't he, calling it a genocide of white farmers. Though the source also knows he claimed the race of the victims didn't matter to him.
Okay, so that's the immediate event.
hmm
But like you said, the history is crucial here. How did we even get to a point where this is happening? We need to go back, right, way back.
Absolutely. You really can't understand the present without digging into the past. I mean, we're talking roots going back to 1652.
1652, wow.
Yeah, the Dutch East India Company setting up at the
Yeah.
Cape. And that small settlement, it grew over time. You had German immigrants, French Huguenots joining the Dutch settlers. That's kind of the origin of the Afrikaner population.
Okay, so Dutch, German, French.
hmm Then, of course, the British Empire arrives in the 19th century. And, empires expand. That led to conflict. Big conflicts, actually.
Like the Boer War.
Exactly, particularly the Second Boer War. And the transcript points out, crucially, this was tied up with the discovery of gold in the Transvaal region, which the Boers controlled. Resources, conflict.
Hmm.
It's a familiar story.
It is indeed. So those early tensions, they sort of paved the way for the really difficult parts of the 20th century, didn't they? I mean, apartheid.
Yeah, absolutely paved the way. In 1948, the National Party comes to power and formally establishes apartheid. It was, a system of legal, racial segregation, discrimination, giving enormous privilege to the white minority.
A brutal system.
Extremely. And the transcript mentions key moments, like the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, a real turning point. That event, among others, led Nelson Mandela and the ANC to shift tactics, moving from nonviolence towards armed resistance. And that, of course, led to his long imprisonment in 1961 right through to 1990.
Almost 3 decades.
Yeah. And it's interesting the transcript reminds us South Africa technically became independent earlier as Rhodesia in 1965,
But
but
under a white minority government.
exactly, which just underscores how entrenched that racial hierarchy was. The end of apartheid, when it finally came, was due to this massive combination of internal resistance and huge international pressure.
Culminating in Mandela's release in 90 and then becoming president in 94.
Right. The unbanning of the ANC, his release, that historic election.
And for a lot of people looking from the outside, maybe that felt like, okay, chapter closed, problem solved, move towards equality. But the source we looked at suggests, well, maybe not so simple, that new issues arose, especially for white South Africans.
That's a really important nuance the transcript brings up. Dismantling the legal structures of apartheid was obviously monumental, a huge victory. But since then, you've had these claims, these narratives of increasing discrimination against white South Africans.
Okay, and the demographics have shifted dramatically too, right?
Massively. It's crucial context. So currently, black Africans make up something like 81.4% of the population. Colored individuals are around 8.2%, and white South Africans are down to about 7.3%.
Wow, 7.3%.
Yeah. Compare that to, say, 1904, when the white population was about 21.6%. Even in 1960, it was still around 20%. So it's a significant decline as a share of the total population.
And this demographic change is happening alongside some really major policy initiatives. Let's talk about this land expropriation without compensation. That sounds intense.
It is intense, and it's definitely a central point of friction and, frankly, fear. The transcript explains that President Ramaphosa leading the ANC, which, remember, has governed continuously since '94, signed this law. It allows the state to take land without paying the owners.
Without compensation.
Right. And given that, historically, land ownership was massively skewed towards white South Africans due to apartheid and colonial history, you can see why this is generating such strong reactions.
What's the justification given?
The official term is reparative justice. The idea is to correct the historical imbalance created by apartheid. But the critics, as highlighted in the source, they immediately raise concerns. They point to Zimbabwe.
Right, the land redistribution there had disastrous economic consequences.
Exactly. That's the fear that it could repeat that pattern.
Right.
And this new law replaces an older principle from 1975, actually, the willing seller, willing buyer principle.
Which meant?
Which meant the government could generally only buy land if the owner agreed to sell, and they agreed on a price. Now, the new law does have clauses mentioning things like just and equitable considerations and public interest.
But the argument is those are vague or not strong enough.
Well, the argument presented in our source is that these phrases might not offer much real protection or limitation on the state's power in practice. And you've got significant opposition, like the Democratic Alliance Party, fighting against it.
Okay, so land is one major area. But it's not just land, is it? There are other laws mentioned.
No, it's broader. The transcript talks about a whole framework, really, of racial preference laws enacted after apartheid ended. Things like the Employment Equity Act, the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act, often called BEE, and the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act.
And these are essentially forms of affirmative action.
Yes, that's how they function. They're designed explicitly to favor Black ownership, Black management, Black employment, procurement from Black-owned businesses. The stated goal, again, is reparations trying to address those deep economic inequalities left over from apartheid.
And the scale of this, the source mentioned a specific number.
Yeah, it's quite striking. As of October 2023, the source cited 141 separate acts of parliament that contain open racial preferences.
141, that's a lot.
It is. And this, brings up that wider, often difficult conversation about racial reparations logic. The source kind of touches on the potential dangers or complexities, how efforts to fix past wrongs can sometimes be seen as creating new issues or potentially fueling resentment. It's a delicate balance.
And the source noted a trend, like maybe it wasn't always increasing.
Right. Interestingly, it mentioned a slight dip in this kind of race-based law right after apartheid ended, but then a sharp reversal by the mid-90s, with the trend going strongly upwards again.
And the ANC being empowered this whole time is key to that trajectory.
Absolutely. Yeah. The transcript points out that under former President Jacob Zuma, the rhetoric and policy really emphasized making fundamental change in ownership patterns explicitly along racial lines.
And there are geopolitical dimensions, too, the ANC's connections.
Yeah, the transcript mentions the ANC's links with China, Russia, Iran. This is alongside the fact that their electoral support has actually been declining recently. So it's a complex, dynamic political picture.
And within that picture, you also have more radical voices emerging, like Julius Malema.
Yes, Julius Malema and his party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF. They represent a more radical flank. It's described as a communist, Black nationalist ideology.
And the transcript mentioned something particularly concerning, a chant.
It did. It cited a specific rally where Malema was leading a large crowd chanting, "Kill the Boer, the farmer."
Wow.
Yeah, and that chant is widely seen and certainly presented in the source material as, well, hate speech, as having genocidal undertones, particularly given the context of farm attacks.
That's incredibly disturbing. So, okay, putting all this together, the history, the land laws, the preference policies, the rhetoric, we come back to the original news. The U.S. granting refugee status. Why, according to the source, was there puzzlement on the left about this?
Well, the transcript suggests that for some on the left, the very idea of white people being refugees is difficult to process, perhaps because of historical power dynamics. This view is contrasted in the source with a statement from a State Department official, Deputy Assistant Secretary Chris Lando.
What did he say?
He suggested that Afrikaners might find it easier to assimilate into U.S. society compared to, say, refugees from Afghanistan.
And his reasoning?
Factors like many speak English, they might lean towards capitalist ideas, and generally agree with fundamental U.S. constitutional rights. The implication being these factors might present more challenges for refugees from very different cultural, linguistic, or political backgrounds.
I can imagine that didn't go down well.
No, it sparked a big backlash. The transcript mentions a New Republic article calling that perspective racist, basically arguing you shouldn't assess refugees based on perceived ease of assimilation.
Although the source also brings up a UK comparison.
Yeah, it points to the UK Labour leader, Keir Starmer, who has actually talked about the importance of English language ability for immigrants. So the idea of assimilative capacity isn't perhaps totally absent across the political spectrum, even if Lando's specific framing was controversial.
So, what's the underlying reason for the left's reaction, according to the source?
The transcript suggests it might connect to a concept it calls reparative guilt, like a feeling that Western nations, particularly those with histories tied to colonialism or white privilege, have a kind of historical obligation to be broadly open to immigrants, maybe regardless of assimilation factors, almost viewing the U.S. as South Africa writ large, in a sense.
And there were concrete examples of this reaction.
Yes, the source mentions the Episcopal Church actually pulling out of some refugee resettlement work because the focus shifted to these white South Africans. And also MSNBC reporting that tended to downplay the racial element in South African violence statistics.
Okay, so this whole episode really taps into much older debates within the U.S. itself about immigration and assimilation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The source explicitly makes that connection. It reminds us, this isn't new territory for the U.S. Think about the strong anti-German or anti-Irish feelings back in the 19th century.
The Know-Nothing Party, the kind of conflict shown in films like Gangs of New York.
Exactly. There have always been anxieties and debates about whether different groups could or would fit into American society.
And then there was a major policy shift in the 60s.
Huge shift. The transcript highlights the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which Teddy Kennedy championed. That act fundamentally changed U.S. immigration. It got rid of the old national origins quota system. That system was based, often implicitly, on assumptions about which nationalities were more desirable or more likely to assimilate.
Okay, so what replaced the quotas?
The new system prioritized family reunification, and the result was a dramatic change in where immigrants came from. Much more immigration from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and way less from Europe compared to before.
And the thinking behind that 1965 change.
According to the source, Kennedy and others argued the old quotas were unfair, discriminatory, and went against American ideals of being a welcoming nation, a nation of immigrants, open to all.
But the transcript adds another layer to that, about the context changing.
Yeah, it makes an interesting point. It suggests that back when immigration policy heavily emphasized self-sufficiency before the large-scale welfare state, there was perhaps a stronger, more immediate pressure for immigrants to assimilate simply to survive and succeed.
Implying the welfare state might change incentives.
Potentially, yes. The argument hinted at is that the existence of a social safety net might alter the dynamic, perhaps attracting immigrants with different expectations or reducing the immediate economic necessity for rapid assimilation that might have existed in earlier eras.
So wrapping this all up, the controversy over refugee status for white South Africans really seems to crystallize these deep, ongoing disagreements.
Exactly. It touches on fundamentally different views about what assimilation means, whether it matters, what national identity is, and what obligations a country like the U.S. has, both historically and today, towards people seeking refuge from elsewhere.
Okay, we certainly covered a lot of ground here. A really complex situation with deep historical roots and very current, very charged debates. We've looked at the specific claims coming out of South Africa, the reasons for granting refugee status, the controversy that erupted, especially around assimilation, and how this all connects back to America's own long history with immigration. So maybe the final thought to leave you, our listener, with is this. Considering everything we've just explored, what does it really mean for a country to offer refuge? And maybe more pointedly, what factors should be considered when deciding who gets welcomed? It forces you to grapple with these tangled histories, these ongoing injustices, and how they play out in ways we might not always expect.